They called it standard paperwork. They didn't expect me to read it like a war plan or remember every comma they forgot to change. The conference room smelled like budget coffee and recycled tension. HR had booked it for 9 odd a.m. sharp, but they were already seated when I walked in at 8:57. Three of them, one memo. I took the seat farthest from the door, on purpose. Let them think I was cornered. Across from me sat Marcia, Director of People Operations, in her signature lavender blouse that said, "I care," and eyes that didn't. Beside her, Julian from Compliance tapped nervously at a manila folder. The third chair belonged to someone I hadn't expected. Kelly from Legal, their in-house counsel. She gave a quick, brittle smile that said, "This won't take long and it won't be a conversation." The table was bare except for the memo. I didn't reach for it. "We want to start by thanking you for your contributions," Marcia began, folding her hands like a prayer she didn't believe in. "This isn't personal." That line, always that line. They never realize how personal it is until someone quotes it back during discovery. I didn't interrupt. I nodded once. Julian slid the memo across the table. It landed with a soft thunk, a sound I would come to replay in my head for days. "Per company policy," Kelly chimed in, "this outlines your formal separation, effective today. Final paycheck included. We've added a severance package equal to 4 weeks' salary, provided you agree to the standard non-disclosure and non-disparagement clauses." She tapped her pen precisely on the corner of the second page. Clause 4. Micro smile. Micro clue. I picked up the document, flipping pages with deliberate slowness. They weren't expecting that. They expected panic, not precision. Page 1. Dates. Reason. Misalignment with company values. Page 2. Severance breakdown. COBRA details. Page 3. You agree not to pursue any further internal grievance. Page 4. NDA clause. Standard language, lazy copy-paste. And then, page 6. Clause 4. I paused. Not visibly, not theatrically, just long enough. Page 6 was formatted slightly differently, a new clause inserted, but the formatting hadn't been updated in the footer. Rookie mistake. Whoever recycled the document forgot that track changes doesn't erase metadata. I raised my eyes but said nothing. Just signed. Kelly's pen was already waiting when I handed it back. She didn't read where I signed. Marcia exhaled like she'd been holding her breath through the entire script. "Thank you again. We'll walk you out at your convenience." I smiled. Already packed. In truth, I'd cleared my desk 2 nights ago. I'd seen the Slack freeze, the calendar invite to HR labeled touch base, the disappearing documents in our shared drive. HR's fingerprints were all over it, but they always forget that Zoom has export logs. Who clicked, who viewed, who edited. As I walked out, I nodded at the security guard and took the long way to the exit, past the wall of smiling employee photos. Mine was already gone, but what they hadn't removed was more important. At 2:41 a.m. that night, my phone buzzed. Counsel, private number. "Did you actually read page 6, clause 4? I didn't hesitate. "It excludes the NDA section," I said calmly. "Your standard template, your words." There was a long pause on the other end. "Are you saying—" he started. I cut him off. "I'm saying your memo isn't enforceable because someone forgot to lock the version history." They thought it was over the moment I signed, but I had already started reading the next move. 3 hours before that 2:41 a.m. call, I sat in my apartment lit only by the glow of my screen and a dull orange lamp I'd inherited from a roommate who left without paying rent. The silence was comfortable, familiar, the kind that lets you think in layers. I wasn't sad. That surprised me. I was watching, the way a chess player watches after sacrificing her queen. HR thought they'd ended a game, but I had only flipped the board. Clause 4 had been sloppy, but it was more than sloppy. It was a mismatch. The memo used language from 2 different policy versions, one from last quarter, one from 18 months ago. And deep in the folder they'd copied it from, terms, final vi 3.1, was the smoking gun. An internal review suggesting those clauses couldn't legally coexist. I knew that because I'd helped write that review. The irony wasn't lost on me. They used my own phrasing to bury me. I'd only noticed because of a line that didn't sound like Marcia. Too polished, too tight, too much like, Me, so I did what any too intense person does at midnight. I opened my backup drive. 4 years worth of policy drafts, Slack exports, compliance walkthroughs. Because when people expect you to clean up their messes, you learn to keep every broom. One file stood out. Template and exceptions.docx, last modified 14 months ago. Created by Kelly R. I opened it. And there it was, in plain Helvetica. In the event of termination, exclusion of NDA obligations is permitted only when a cause clause is not explicitly invoked. See Clause 4 Exceptions, page 6, subsection B. In their memo, they'd forgotten to include the cause clause, which meant, legally, the NDA section didn't bind me. They'd handed me their own escape hatch, formatted in bullet points. Mini intrigue every 2 to 3 paragraphs? Here's one. The document had been downloaded 3 times in the past 48 hours. Once from Kelly's machine, twice from Julian's. The system metadata didn't lie. The access log was still public because they'd never changed my credentials. I took screenshots of everything. And then I opened Zoom, not for a meeting, for the recording archive. They had no idea I had admin-level viewing. They assumed once they pulled my calendar access, my privileges vanished too. But Firma's outdated permission settings always lagged a cycle behind. And I'd quietly stayed listed as guest admin ever since the Q2 onboarding project they forgot I ran. In the Zoom archive, I found it. The call from 4 days ago labeled Leadership Sync. Kelly's voice. We'll just include the template and redact later if she pushes back. Nobody reads Clause 4. Julian. Can she challenge it? Kelly laughing. Please, she's intense, not stupid. She'll sign to get out. They all do. I sat there, still, calm. That line, she's intense, not stupid. It echoed. They'd meant it as dismissal. I took it as prophecy. At 2:39 a.m., I copied everything onto a labeled USB, Termination Memo, version trail. At 2:40 a.m., I sent an email to Firma's external legal rep, CCing the counsel's direct line with no attachments. Just one sentence. Please confirm whether this memo intends to bind post-termination silence under the excluded Clause 4. The phone rang at 2:41 a.m. You know what happened next. They played corporate chess with someone who built the board, and I hadn't even used my queen yet. Have they ever called you too intense just for doing your job right? Comment Clause 4 if you've ever been underestimated, and still won. The email I sent at 2:40 a.m. didn't contain a threat. It didn't need to. In legal, implication is sharper than accusation, especially when backed by metadata and their own recycled wording. But what followed wasn't silence. It was a ripple. By 7:08 a.m., I was awake again, only because my phone buzzed with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in months. Subject: You didn't hear this from me. Body: Kelly just called an emergency with counsel. Something about clause conflicts. You okay? It was from Priya, former compliance analyst now gone to a startup that actually believed in version control and daylight. We weren't close, but she had always respected my attention to detail. I'd once covered for her when Julian accidentally deleted her audit trail before a board presentation. That message confirmed it. The memo wasn't just invalid, it was dangerous. Because if I chose to talk, publicly, legally, or anonymously, what HR had called routine could turn into retaliation. And retaliation, that opens a whole other clause. I put on a hoodie and brewed coffee in complete silence. No music, no calls, just the rhythm of drip, 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 and one window open to my private folder marked HR Memos Comparative. By 7:42 a.m., I had compiled 5 termination memos from former employees, pulled from shared drafts, accidental backups, and a cloud misconfiguration Julian once left open for 11 days. All of them used the same template. None of them had a Clause 4 exception. All of them were signed without question. All of them were binding, except mine. Minicliff. As promised, I ran those documents through a comparison tool. Same font, same format. Until Kelly's memo. Mine. It had a hidden comment. One that wasn't deleted, just resolved. Need to remove this line if we include NDA exclusion. Risk of backfire if she reviews. KR. 5:12 p.m. They didn't remove the line, they just hoped I wouldn't notice. I sat back, heart slow, thoughts fast. If they were scared enough to redact comments but not smart enough to clean version history, then they were scared enough to settle quietly. But settling meant something else. Leverage. So I waited. Not long, just until 9:17 a.m. when I got a calendar invite. Title, Clarification Call, HR Council. Time, 10 a.m. Attendees, Kelly, Julian, Marcia. Optional, me. That last part made me laugh out loud. Optional. They still thought they were driving. At 10 on the dot, I joined. Kelly opened with a practiced smile. Thanks for making time. We just wanted to clear up any confusion about yesterday's memo. I raised one hand. I'll record this, I said, clicking the Zoom button. Kelly blinked. Julian froze. Marcia leaned in. That's not standard. Neither is forgetting to remove internal counsel notes, I said. Clause 4, remember? Silence. 3 seconds. 4. Kelly adjusted her mic. What exactly are you looking for here? I answered with the calm of someone who'd already won. Nothing. Yet. Just wanted to make sure we're all clear, on the record, that Clause 4 excludes the NDA, that the memo used non-binding language, and that your internal drafts acknowledge potential retaliation exposure. Click. End recording. I didn't wait for their response. Letting silence stretch was its own tactic. The call ended at 10:07 a.m. By 10:14, I received 2 emails, one from legal, we'd like to propose a mutual clarification agreement, and one from Marcia. Would you be open to a final check-in to discuss your offboarding experience? Offboarding experience. They really wanted to reframe this as a misunderstanding. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was methodical. Like organizing old files by date modified. Satisfying, predictable, clean. I replied to neither message. Instead, I opened the browser tab I hadn't touched in a year. Secure Submit, Firma Ethics and Compliance Portal. Anonymous reports, welcome. Encryption, guaranteed. 2 clicks later, I began uploading. Screenshots of the draft trail. The redacted comment from Kelly. 5 previous memos with missing Clause 4 structures. A transcript of the Leadership Sync Zoom call. A screenshot of Priya's message with identifying info blacked out. I added no narrative, no embellishment, just facts, like puzzle pieces scattered on a lawyer's desk. Mini hook. The portal blinked once, then twice, then gave me a submission code and 1 sentence. A member of our external review team will follow up within 3 to 5 business days. I smiled. Not because it was over, because now it wasn't up to HR anymore. Let me tell you something about too intense. It's a label used by people who fear confrontation but crave control. It's how HR tags women who memorize policy better than legal. It's how they say, don't look too closely. But I had always looked too closely. That's why they wanted me out. And it was why I knew exactly what to do next. At 1:22 p.m., I forwarded a clean version of the memo. No comments, no annotations, just the copy they handed me to an old contact, Leah Chen, legal correspondent at Corporate Watch. Subject, a memo worth reading. I didn't include a signature. Mini-cliff every 2 to 3 paragraphs? Here you go. At 1:46 p.m., she replied, Holy sh*t, is this active? Then, after 10 seconds, can you talk off record? I typed back 1 word. Depends on Clause 4, doesn't it? And I closed my laptop. Not because I was done, because the next move wasn't mine to make. By evening, the building I used to badge into every morning felt like a different city, one I could finally observe without needing permission. From my apartment window, the skyline looked calmer than I felt. Offices still glowed, desks still hummed. Somewhere inside those glass rectangles, people were still pretending policies were neutral and power was invisible. At 6:11 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Not legal, not HR. Unknown number. Please confirm you received the clarification proposal. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened the proposal they'd sent earlier. 12 pages. Polite language, soft edges, a promise of mutual confidentiality, a revised severance, and, buried near the end, a sentence that tried to resurrect the NDA by implication rather than clause. They were testing the perimeter. Mini-cliff. The document referenced my termination memo, but attached a different version, one that didn't exist at the time I signed. That wasn't a mistake. That was retroactive editing. I highlighted the discrepancy, saved a copy, and added it to a growing folder labeled After Signing. Every file in that folder had one thing in common: a timestamp after my signature. That folder was starting to look expensive. At 7:03 p.m., Leah Chen called. Her voice was sharp, curious, restrained, the voice of someone who knows when a story breathes and when it suffocates. She didn't ask how I was. She asked what I wanted. "I want accuracy," I said, "and distance." She paused. "That's not how most people answer." "I'm not most people," I replied. "And I'm not angry. I'm careful." We spoke for 12 minutes. I didn't name names. I didn't describe motives. I didn't speculate. I described documents, dates, versions, clauses. I let the paper speak. When we hung up, she said one last thing. "If this goes public, it won't be loud at first. It'll be precise." That word again. Later that night, as rain traced thin lines down my window, I opened my calendar out of habit. Tomorrow was empty. No meetings, no touch bases, no check-ins designed to corner me into silence. Freedom looked strange on a schedule. At 11:58 p.m., an email landed from Firma's external counsel. Subject: Clarification. Body: We believe it's in everyone's interest to resolve this discreetly. Please advise what terms you consider reasonable. Reasonable. I typed my reply slowly. Please confirm in writing that the original Termination Memo excludes NDA obligations per page 6, clause 4, and that no retroactive documents apply. Once confirmed, I'll consider next steps. I hit send. Mini cliff, the kind that tightens the room. 3 minutes later, the message was marked read. No reply followed. Not that night. Not yet. And for the first time since HR slid that memo across the table, I slept without setting an alarm. Morning arrived without urgency. No calendar alerts, no Slack pings. Just the quiet certainty that something had shifted, and that it wasn't going back. At 8:19 a.m., I checked my inbox out of habit, not hope. There it was. From External Counsel. Subject: Confirmation. One word in the subject line. No pleasantries, no legal padding. I opened it slowly. We confirm that the termination memo executed on date excludes NDA obligations pursuant to page 6, clause 4, and that no subsequent or retroactive documentation alters the terms of the executed agreement. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no warmth, just confirmation. I leaned back in my chair and let the weight of that sentence settle. It wasn't victory in the cinematic sense. No applause, no courtroom drama, just a door closing, quietly, on their ability to control the narrative. But something else followed. 9 minutes later, another email arrived. Different sender, internal domain. From Firma Ethics and Compliance Subject. Follow-up on submission code RECP 44721. They moved faster than promised, which meant one thing. What I'd submitted wasn't isolated. They asked for clarification on 2 items, not denials, clarifications. Mini-cliff, one of the items referenced pattern consistency across multiple termination memos. Pattern. That word doesn't belong to accidents. I answered with restraint. Screenshots only, no commentary. Let them connect dots they were trained to recognize. Around noon, my phone rang again. Kelly. I didn't answer. She called twice more, then sent a message, shorter than usual. We should talk. I imagined her office, blinds half closed, legal pads stacked too neatly, the hum of a building that suddenly felt less secure. I imagined Marcia rehearsing empathy in front of a mirror, Julian refreshing his inbox every 30 seconds. For the first time, they were reacting, not directing. At 2:06 p.m., Leah Chen texted, "They're scrambling. Not public yet, but it's moving." I stared at the message longer than necessary. This was the moment people fantasize about, the point where you strike back, expose everything, burn bridges loudly enough to feel vindicated. But I didn't feel vindictive. I felt finished. I replied, "Accuracy over speed, always." By late afternoon, the company updated its internal policy portal, quietly. No announcement. Just a revised termination template uploaded with a new footer date and a corrected clause structure. They were patching the leak. Mini hook. Subtle but sharp. They didn't credit the change to feedback. or review or compliance updates. They just fixed it, which meant someone else wouldn't have to read Clause 4 at 2:41 a.m. As the sun dipped and the city shifted into evening, I closed my laptop and stepped outside. The air felt different when you weren't carrying someone else's silence. They had called me too intense. What they meant was, she remembers, she documents, she doesn't panic, and that scared them more than anger ever could. The first public sign wasn't an article, it was a pause. No press release, no internal memo explaining the updated policy, no all-hands Zoom with carefully curated concern. Just a stillness inside the company's outward noise, like a machine that had skipped a beat and hoped no one noticed. I noticed. So did others. At 9:34 a.m., an unfamiliar name appeared in my inbox. Former employee, different department, same subject line structure. Subject: question about Clause 4. I didn't reply right away. I read it twice. She wrote carefully, like someone who'd been burned by enthusiasm before. She mentioned her own termination memo signed months ago. She asked whether exclusions applied retroactively. She asked whether version history mattered. She asked, almost as an afterthought, whether silence was the only safe option. I closed the email without answering. Then another arrived. Then another. 3 messages in one morning, all orbiting the same quiet center. What if the paperwork isn't what they told us it was? That was the thing HR never anticipates. They manage individuals well. They're less prepared for patterns becoming visible. Mini-cliff. One message included a screenshot. Same template, same formatting error, same clause numbering, different name. I replied to none of them directly. Instead, I forwarded the screenshots, stripped of names and identifiers, to the ethics and compliance contact who'd already reached out. One line in the body. Additional examples, same structure, different dates. Nothing more. By noon, my phone rang from a blocked number. I let it ring out. At 12:17 p.m., a voicemail followed. This is Daniel from People Operations. I just wanted to say, off the record, that some of us are glad you spoke up. People Operations. The irony almost made me smile. Off the record, apologies are the currency of systems that don't know how to admit fault out loud. They want resolution without reflection, closure without accountability. I deleted the voicemail, not out of spite, out of clarity. That afternoon, I met Leah in person for the first time. A quiet cafe, neutral territory. She brought no recorder, no notebook, just questions that respected silence as much as speech. She didn't ask for names. She asked for timelines. She didn't ask for outrage. She asked for documentation. Mini-hook, the kind journalists live for. She told me the legal desk had already flagged Firma internally, not for one incident, but for inconsistencies. That word again. The one compliance teams pretend not to fear. Inconsistencies invite regulators, she said, not headlines. At first, I nodded. Good. When we parted, she said something that stayed with me. Stories like this don't explode, she said. They erode. That evening, I watched the sun slide behind the buildings and thought about erosion, how water doesn't fight rock. It just keeps moving, keeps touching the same place until something changes. My inbox stayed quiet after that. No more calls from HR. No more just checking in messages. The system had recalibrated, found a new equilibrium, one that didn't include me as a variable to be managed. Mini-cliff, quiet but deliberate. At 10:02 p.m., Ethics and Compliance emailed again. This time, not for clarification, for acknowledgement. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We are reviewing the matter as part of a broader internal assessment. Broader. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a moment longer than necessary. Not waiting. Just listening to the absence of pressure. They had tried to label me too intense. What they'd really encountered was continuity, memory that didn't reset when they wanted it to, and once a system realizes it's being observed, it never quite behaves the same way again. The review didn't announce itself. No subject line screamed urgency. No calendar blocks appeared, politely demanding attention. It surfaced the way these things always do, through small, unignorable shifts. A former colleague updated her LinkedIn headline. Previously, Firma. Nothing more. No celebration, no explanation. Another removed a certification badge tied directly to an internal compliance program I'd helped design years ago. That one stung. Not emotionally, but structurally. When people quietly distance themselves from the credentials, it's because they sense instability upstream. I didn't reach out. Observation had become my role. By midweek, Firma's internal job postings changed tone, less culture first, more risk aware. HR language always evolves before accountability does. It's how organizations rehearse responsibility without admitting guilt, Cliff. One posting included a line that hadn't existed before. Experience with regulatory remediation preferred. Remediation is what comes after the problem is acknowledged, even if no one has said it out loud yet. That afternoon, Ethics and Compliance emailed again, this time not from a generic inbox. A name, a title, a signature that carried weight. They thanked me. Again. They asked if I'd be willing to answer questions informally. They stressed there was no obligation. No obligation is corporate code for we can't compel you, but we hope you will. I agreed to a call. On my terms. The conversation lasted 26 minutes. I didn't speculate. I didn't accuse. I described workflows, approval chains, how termination memos were generated, copied, reused, where pressure shortened review cycles, where assumptions replaced verification. At one point, the reviewer paused. So HR didn't intend harm? She asked carefully. That's not the question, I replied. Intent doesn't negate structure, and structure creates outcomes. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. Mini hook. She asked whether I believe the issue was isolated. I answered honestly. No, but I believe it's correctable. That mattered more than outrage ever could. After the call, I took a long walk, past offices with glass walls and slogans about transparency, past cafes where people drafted emails they hoped wouldn't be screenshotted someday, past a version of myself that once believed excellence alone protected you. It doesn't. Documentation does. Late that night, Leah published a short piece, not about me, not even about Firma, by name. It focused on a trend, termination templates reused across companies, clause mismatches, the quiet legal gray zones employees rarely challenge. It didn't go viral. It didn't need to. Industry newsletters picked it up. Compliance forums discussed it. A law firm tweeted a thread. Careful, cautious, curious, erosion. By the weekend, Firma's leadership page updated. A new role appeared beneath HR Director of Policy Integrity. I laughed softly when I saw it, not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. They hadn't admitted fault. They hadn't apologized. They had adapted, and that was enough, not for closure, but for proof. They once wrote that I was too intense for the team. What they hadn't realized was this. Intensity isn't volume, it's consistency. And systems don't change because someone yells at them. They change because someone remembers how they work and refuses to forget. The quiet after adaptation is different from silence. Silence waits. This kind of quiet settles. Weeks passed without incident, which was itself an incident. No follow-ups from ethics and compliance, no calls from legal just to check in, no friendly messages from HR pretending nothing had happened. Firma had absorbed the shock and sealed the seams. That's how institutions survive, not by admitting failure, but by adjusting their posture until the pressure dissipates. I noticed it first in the language. Public statements shifted subtly, not about terminations, never that, but about process rigor and policy stewardship. Words designed to reassure investors and confuse employees in equal measure. Internally, managers were suddenly encouraged to consult legal earlier. Templates were locked. Version histories restricted. Mini cliff. Someone, somewhere, had lost editing privileges they once took for granted. At a networking event I almost didn't attend. A former VP from Firma spotted me across the room. He hesitated before approaching, like someone unsure whether a conversation might be recorded by memory alone. I heard things changed after you left, he said lightly. Things always change, I replied. Leaving just makes it easier to see. He nodded, then lowered his voice. You know, some people think you scared them. I considered that. The word scared implies intention. I didn't scare anyone, I said. I stopped participating. That distinction mattered. Later that night, scrolling through old files I was finally ready to archive, I found my first performance review at Firma, 5 years old. Buried praise, a familiar line. Exceptionally thorough, occasionally overwhelming. Overwhelming. They'd been telling me who I was from the beginning. I just assumed it was a compliment wrapped in discomfort. Mini hook. What if it was neither? What if it was a warning from them to themselves that I wouldn't forget how things worked? I closed the file and deleted the folder, not out of bitterness, out of completion. The next morning, I received one last email from Ethics and Compliance. No request, no update, just a sentence. The review has concluded. Nothing more. That was the closest thing to an ending I was going to get. I made coffee, sat by the window, watched the city move the way it always does, forward, indifferent, quietly dependent on people who notice details and rarely get thanked for it. They had tried to define me with a sentence in a termination memo. Too intense. Not a fit. A risk. What they created instead was a record. One that didn't need my voice anymore to exist. And that was the real shift. Not that I'd won, but that the system had learned it was observable. Once that happens, control becomes temporary. Closure didn't arrive with a meeting or a message. It came quietly, disguised as normalcy. One morning, months later, I opened my inbox and realized something had changed. Not externally, but internally. I wasn't scanning for threats anymore. I wasn't bracing for language traps or wondering what clause someone might weaponize next. The vigilance had softened. Not disappeared, just recalibrated. I'd started consulting by then. Nothing dramatic, short-term reviews, policy audits, quiet work for organizations that wanted to understand where their processes leaked power without meaning to. I never mentioned Firma unless asked. I didn't need to. Their shadow spoke for itself in how carefully people now phrase their questions. One client said it plainly. We're not afraid of lawsuits. We're afraid of blind spots. That was the word they were finally learning. Occasionally, someone from Firma crossed my digital periphery, a profile view, a mutual connection request left unanswered, a carefully neutral endorsement that said I see you without inviting conversation. I didn't take it personally. Distance had become a form of respect. Mini cliff, the last one. Late one night, I reread the termination memo for the final time, not to analyze it, not to annotate, just to see it as an artifact. Frozen, inert, powerless. The sentence was still there. She's too intense for the team. It no longer felt like an accusation or a misunderstanding. It felt like a confession. They hadn't known what to do with someone who remembered. Someone who read page 6, someone who didn't confuse compliance with morality or silence with agreement. I closed the document and deleted it, not because it didn't matter anymore, but because it had already done its work. The system adjusted, others benefited, and I walked away without raising my voice or breaking a rule. That's the part people miss. Change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just leaves a corrected template behind, and a quiet understanding that someone, somewhere, is still reading.